Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. And today we're talking about the fantasy world of Ralph Ellis. It just never ends. One person is the same guy as the next one. Before you know it, he's the same person as 10 different people. But next day, he's 50 different people. And who knows where we go from there. So how's everybody doing today?
Real good.
Doing well, thank you.
Doing well here. Glad to be hopping into this fantasy world where there's, one Jesus to rule them all, one Jesus to bind them.
Yeah, Jesus is Jesus. Yeah, he's got Ralph Ellis as Jesus being the king of Parthia, Rome, Edessa, Adiabeni. Oh, and more recently now, Emesa, because Emesa sounds like Edessa according to him. So there you go. Location,
and of course, England and probably Westeros.
Why not?
And Mordor.
Yeah, I'll be showing some slides, screenshots I've taken from Ralph's interaction with you, Dr. Adair and Dr. McClellan, 9 years ago. Before we get to those, I feel like it would be appropriate to start with this one, in which really highlights the character of Ellis, and that he just doesn't make any sense either, because he says that James Valliant plagiarized his books. But if you notice, in the first paragraph, in which he makes the claim that that James Valliant did not read his books, you go to the last one. He says, "Remind them that their theory is firmly based upon my much earlier research." Well, wait a minute. Your first paragraph said that James Valliant didn't read your book, so which is it? Did he have foresight or something? Oh,
well, I not his the one assertion is correct. The other assertion is not correct. I had not read a sentence of any essay, book, or anything else by Mr. Ralph Ellis prior to the publication of Creating Christ. I was unfamiliar with his work. It was the publication of Creating Christ that first made me aware. And let me just take this opportunity to say that the reason why I'm here and the reason why Ralph Ellis is a concern to me is precisely because it came to my attention that he's somehow associated with Roman provenance, and but it pure nonsense in my view. And I want
right.
And
I don't even
leading representative of that school, and he's a crackpot, and I want to be associated from that idea as far as possible. I'm not aware of any ideas that I share with him. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that every idea that I've heard of his that seems distinct to him, unique to Mr. Ellis, is of course patently false. So there's nothing that's distinctly Ellis that I don't think is nonsense. And I'm not sure what, if anything, we actually agree upon. I've not run across any overlap in our thinking.
What do you think about this, Drs. Adair and McClellan? Have either of you seen Ralph going around claiming that this guy and that guy copied his works when they did not?
That was new for us, but Dan, I don't know how much we want to give introduction to how we first came to know, unfortunately come to know Ellis's work. Just the basics was that, like, at least for me, I got into looking at his claims was because he was literally cyberbullying a friend of mine who wrote a critical blog post about his ideas, saying this is crazy and outside the academic norm, and everything looked crackpot. And then from there, Ellis went just total cyberbully on him. And so myself, Dan, and others decided, like, okay, let's academically rip him a new one.
Right.
As gently and professionally as possible, of course.
Yes. Like I said, that's why we did it academically.
In the next slide, I want to remind everybody, if I hadn't, I'm pretty sure I've shown this screenshot before. Yeah, I believe I did, the one I did with Derek and you, James Valliant, and also Neil, in which Ralph claimed that I'm a 24/7 alcoholic on the basis that my name Barman, he calls it Barman when it's Berman. He says that it sounds like bar. And on the basis that it sounds like bar, I must be an alcoholic. And apparently I sound inebriated.
Well, I would like to say something about this. I am working on an important writing.
Everybody take their shoes off right now.
And this, I think this fits in with his MO of kind of just squinting at words and names in transliteration and English transliteration, and if he can make the blurred edges overlap,
Well, that's good.
then that is evidence of that they are the one and the same, whether they're etymologically related or not, or whether they require completely ahistorical, just linguistically impossible gymnastics to get them to match. That seems to be what he does. So this is just another example of
really good insight. But I might point out by his same logic here that he's turned you bar man. What is that form of son of man? He's turning you into Jesus.
Actually, I think somewhere he did joke about that.
I work with Jacob Berman on a regular basis. We're working on a writing project together. So if not every day, every other day, I'm in communication with Jacob Berman, and he is a teetotaler. He has never been intoxicated. I've never seen him drink. I've never seen him intoxicated in any way, shape, or form. If my evidence is any indication, Jacob, you are a sober teetotaler. This is a bizarre personal attack, obviously.
And then the next thing I want to do is I want to remind everybody that he thinks I'm Christopher Lawson. Now,
again, I've appeared on interviews with both you, podcast interviews with you and Mr. Lawson simultaneously. I know you to be two distinct individuals. One of whom lives in Texas.
The other in Toronto, Canada. But that doesn't stop Ellis from thinking we're the same guy, because we both criticize him, so we must be the same guy. And by definition, that means everybody in this video is.
And he's suggested that I am Tom Verena as well.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, not based on any etymological overlap in our names, but just based on the
of cross-identifying people as needed in the first century.
This was just the perception that our argumentation seems to resonate with him, and that we seem to be coming up with the same criticisms. And obviously, it's not that educated people find the same problems with his rhetoric. It couldn't be that.
Right.
That could never be the case.
Yeah, two people noticing that he doesn't understand Aramaic grammar. That can only be a conspiracy.
Yeah. Conspiracy theory, obviously. Or his bizarre crossing of different languages to find similarities. No, obviously, it's our fault, and we're all the same person because we're observing the same sort of things that he's doing.
Right.
Couldn't be that, could it, Ralph?
And this is Ralph doing the same thing that he did with my last name, misspelling it on purpose. James, apparently you are Valliant now.
I do that.
Final little paragraph there.
At that point, I have a small opinion of myself.
he misspelled your name from Valliant to Valliant, and he's done this with other people too, and not just with either of us. He did the same thing with what's her name, Dr. Francisca Stavrakopoulos.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he did. I don't have a slide for that one, but he made her last name like much longer, trying to make fun of the way her last name sounds, apparently.
Okay, so that's not professional conduct. I mean, to be treating, a person with a doctorate like that, in effect, name calling, it's childish, it's unprofessional. What can you say?
And a weird thing to go after someone with a Greek name when so many of his arguments are about the esotericness of Greek, and it's like, but now all Greek names are these funny things. I mean, sure, I'll make the joke about the Greek philosopher Testicles, but that's just because I'm copying Robin Williams, not because I'm even original. And I'm definitely not trying to make fun of an actual person. It's just bizarre and just at best childish.
Truly bizarre.
And this is a article you wrote back in 2013 at Dr. McClellan.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about some Ralph stuff there. Could you talk about like the things you focused on debunking in his work? Like what were you focusing on here?
Well, a lot of it has to do with a lot of the linguistic relationships that he's asserting, and also a lot of historical stuff, because what I see is like parallelomania kind of pushed to the max, where if you see any kind of vague similarities in names, in place names, in kind of historical narratives, he just kind of arbitrarily asserts that, oh, these are the same place, the same person, the same kingdom, the same events. And so I started with that, and you can find what is the Adiabini, I think, for instance, when he was saying, well, this means the children of Adai, based on B'nai. I was like, well, if it were that, the B'nai would have to be at the front of the word, because that's where the nomen regans of a construct phrase goes in that language. So Adiabini could not possibly mean children of Adai. And his argument for getting from Adia all the way to Adai was also just linguistic nonsense. And then he's arguing that we have two different towns that were, and I forget exactly what this argument was. Was it Edessa and another location? I think it may have been Adiabini. Said they were the same. They were the same city. Because
I think Antioch. I think there
was it. Yeah, it was Antioch, and saying, well, Josephus doesn't mention one of them, and it was like, but we have a dozen other historians who mention both of them as separate cities with separate peoples and having different relationships with each other. And I think part of it based on the fact that the one Edessa was referred to as Antioch for like a decade or something like that, and it's like, well, there were several cities known as Antioch at the time, so this isn't really demonstrating anything. But those, and a reasonable person, anybody who's familiar with historiography, has any kind of advanced education in this, can immediately see the problems with this. But those criticisms just get ignored in favor of some kind of ad hominem attack or some kind of rhetorical deflection, or saying you misunderstood entirely or something like that. And it's I got frustrated pretty quick. I think I posted twice on my blog about him, and went through a bunch of back and forth in the comments, and a handful of other folks were engaging as well. And it just became clear that he was not going to be reasoned with, that no matter what, it was going to devolve into name calling and pettiness and just personal insults. And it just got to a point where I stopped engaging entirely. It wasn't worth my time. And then I found him in a book that he published shortly after this. He attacked me in his book, and even couldn't even get my education right or anything like that. So I was, it was a weird time in blogging in general, the biblioblog world, and he just made it all the weirder.
Again, how unprofessional. I mean, here are people taking the time to give him serious criticism, and he cannot engage in a civil way, much less a constructive way. And you'd think he would jump at an opportunity to engage with someone. That's what I live for. I know my own work is not maybe as controversial as his, but it's controversial. And so I live to engage critics. Yeah. And I hope it can be a constructive and civil engagement where, whatever our viewers think, they can at least have both sides and think about it for themselves. If you reduce it to name calling, if you get personal like that, no one's going to learn anything. What does he expect? It's just so unprofessional.
And I thought, Aaron, your engagement was, I think there were a couple of posts that you put on your blog as well. And for the most part, we were step by step in a very detailed way outlining the technical problems. And, he kept complaining, nobody's giving me any substantial critique, and that he was looking for a critical review. And then, suggesting that, our peer review process among us is just a bunch of people who already agree, just agreeing that we're all geniuses. And he was, he couldn't find any critical reviews of his work to help improve his scholarship. But if you look through the engagements, this is the kind of stuff we deal with all the time. Other folks engaging our work, and that it just so quickly devolves into name calling and straw men and all that kind of stuff. Makes clear he's not interested in a critique of any kind at all. He's just looking for a fight.
We have a super chat, as a matter of fact, so I'm going to put back the PowerPoint in a second here. The king below, thank you for the super chat. Jesus was the king of Odessa. Michael Jackson was the king of pop. One and the same.
Same title. That will be a basis. If you share the same title at any point in history with someone, Ralph will say, "We'll have no cross-identification."
Ooh, I could connect these. I can do this. Okay, so Michael Jackson was the king of pop, but pop is the Midwestern word for soda. So king of soda, oh soda, soda. There we go.
Well, there's also Odessa, Texas. So
right.
Certainly there's someone with the surname King in Odessa.
Sure. And he probably lives in Corpus Christi.
Oh, he probably thinks Odessa is Odessa too. Why not? Sounds alike. There is something something else I want to point out here before we actually continue on the looking back. This is a hilarious one. I talked about this with Neil and Derek and James Valliant when we did our prior critique on Ellis, where the back of Ralph Ellis's first book on Jesus actually contradicts what's inside it, like literally, because the back of the book, he says Jesus died in AD 65 during the Jewish revolt, but the Jewish revolt didn't even start yet. And inside the book, in page 256, Ralph said he died in AD 68. Jesus, son of Gamaliel, the biblical Jesus, like he likes to put him in the parentheses, died in AD 68. Like, well, which is it, man? And before anyone decides to say, well, the publisher may have screwed up the back of it, Ralph self-publishes. But not regardless, here's a video clip in which Ellis makes the same mistake when he was interviewed.
First century AD. So here's the chap who wrote the whole history of Judea, in fact, the whole history of the Jewish people, but most especially the history of the Jewish War. This is the AD 65, AD 70.
Yeah, the war did not begin until the autumn of 66.
So the same mistake he made in the back of that book, which contradicts what's inside of that book, was repeated in an interview. Yeah. So
I actually also remember the idea that he might have had his publisher screw up the outside jacket of his book. I also remember this from when we were also critiquing the things we were finding inside there, where he was like screwing up like the Hebrew text or the Aramaic text. And I remember in particular, his excuse at that time was he couldn't properly render the characters in Kindle format, yet he did it correctly in other parts of the same book. So just special pleading.
It was the sigma. He would put a sigma on the end of words rather than the final sigma. And then he said, well, it had to be JPEGs. They couldn't handle the font and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, well, you got it right in some places. And ultimately, you're the one approving the proofs. So,
okay, it was the sigmas. Thank you for correcting me on that.
Well, that excuse doesn't even fly. It's astonishing. And he really doesn't have any familiarity with the languages that he's finding significance in the cross meaning of.
Yeah, and I think one of the last posts you had up, Jacob, of mine was where I invited him to translate some sentences I pulled out of a couple of intro textbooks to Aramaic and Greek. And obviously there was no response at all to that.
No, I'm not surprised there. And if the viewers keep sticking around, eventually we're going to get to a list of names. The list of names that Neil showed on his video on Gnostic Informant. I'll leave a link to that in the description. I'll also leave a link. I'll leave links to all these blogs that I'm showing here. The list is longer than that. I actually sent him the list he used in that video. And I've been looking to see if there's more names that Ralph thinks are the same person as Jesus, and there is. It's longer. So I'm going to show that list later in the video, including all the names of Joseph, because Joseph is like 11 different people. Josephus is like 8 different people. We'll get to that list later. Okay, I think I already showed those slides earlier. So now we're to you, Dr. Adair. This is your article. Jesus was King Arthur and a Pharaoh and King of Atussa. This scholarship of Ralph Ellis. I was laughing really hard when I was reading this a few years ago.
Yeah.
This was really good.
Music.
Yeah, I should say that Dan was very nice in describing my attempt at here being scholarly, but when I go back and read it, I was probably having more fun than I would in our proper academic article.
Oh, but come on, it's so fun. Fun to read.
Yeah,
But
I
just
noticed
compare,
the play on words, the annals of so and so. No, this probably came from and then you removed an N in reference to Ellis's own source.
Yeah, I try to make these sort of word games and things like that, especially with someone who needs it. They need punishment.
And one of the things that he does is like take Merlin, for example, in Arthurian legend. He'll literally argue that Merlin is Jesus's father, and like, okay, why do you think Merlin is Jesus's daddy? What's the point there? Well, Merlin sounds like Simon Magus, and they're both magicians. And Simon Magus had a girlfriend named Helen, and it's the same name as Abgar's wife Helen. It's also the same name as Monobaz's wife Helen, so it's the same pair, same person. And therefore, since Abgar is the father of Jesus, which sounds like Jesus, there you go. That's literally his argument.
And so, in his view, a Christian medieval romance about King Arthur discussing Merlin is really just a conspiracy cover, talking an allegory about Joseph, the father of Jesus.
Yeah, that's what he thinks, literally.
And that was actually the chain of logic that we set out to reach that point.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that argument he makes that Jesus is Hippocrates.
It's breathtaking, the number of cross-identifications. It really is. It's not like he's making one or two, simple, this person was that person, and then, giving us a bunch of evidence for that identification. He's making identifications left and right. He needs to marshal tons of evidence for each one, and he just glosses over each of these as if we're supposed to follow this chain, link upon link upon link upon link in his logic, and still have some confidence in what the hell he's saying.
When I look at a lot of his arguments, I get the sense it's very much like a fundamentalist approach to the Bible, in that a fundamentalist might approach the Bible. They just kind of flatten everything chronologically, linguistically, historically. They just flatten everything and then try to create connections to try to extract significance, insight, new interpretive lenses for looking at things. Only with Ralph, it expands to all of ancient history, or at least as much of ancient history as he can get his hands on. And again, just flattens everything and then tries to make connections to try to create some kind of new insight on this that doesn't follow any scholarly standards, that betrays pretty abject ignorance just of the basics of linguistics, of historiography, of all these things. And so it strikes me as kind of an atheist fundamentalism about how to approach these sources. They're very similar methodologies. Like, instead of just the Bible is my paint and palette, and I can just create whatever I want from it. It's all these ancient Roman sources in history are my paint and palette, and I can just create whatever I want with it. And yeah, it's it's odd to see it on that end of things, but obviously there's a market for it. There are folks out there who are eating this up. Otherwise, it would be just an enormous waste of time. And I have to think that that it's not just him trying to scratch his own itches, just publishing this stuff for his own sake.
That's kind of one of the more distressing things about Ellis are the Ellisites. I mean, they're in tens of thousands. He has
Ralph is here, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I know he is.
Yes, I talk of fundamentalism, but I believe in the Mormon Book of Abraham.
Mormon Book of Abraham. Okay, but you make a really
I noticed he keeps attacking you
almost
for some reason.
Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a secular thinker myself, but you make a good point. He uses apologetic methodology, in effect, in his mythicism, hyper-atheism. And that, again, as a secular scholar, I want to dissociate myself from that kind of pseudo-methodology. I mean, bizarre.
Then he complains that he's not included in these discussions because, Ralph, it's a waste of my time to have you in the same video with me or anyone else that's here, because you're just gonna make things worse. You repeat the same errors you've already made or worse.
Yeah. In fact, if I can give an example of that, because one of the reasons I blocked him from blogging on my site was when I was critiquing his work. In particular, I found a spot where he made literally 3 mistakes in one word, which is already kind of an accomplishment. So he was talking about various star gods, and in his list he said the god Zoroastra, which is 3 mistakes in one, because first off, it's Zoroaster, so somehow he has feminized Zoroaster, so I guess he's also Addis and he's been castrated. I don't know. Secondly, Zoroaster is not a god, and third, his name has nothing to do with star or star worship, because his original name in the Avestan language is Zarathustra. It just becomes translated into Greek and has that aster-like ending because of how the Greeks put it together. So literally 3 mistakes in one word. So when I present that, he completely denies he ever said that. He says I'm lying. And then another blog post, I literally quote him like chapter and verse from his book. And then the comments, he's just like, yeah, so what? It's like, well, first off, you called me a liar. 2, it's wrong. And 3, where's my apology? What? No, it's clearly that's not someone you can work with who makes such bold, wrong claims, will deny he ever said it and, to call you a liar, and then just back away and just say, well, it never actually even mattered in the first place. Yeah, you can't have reasonable discussions with that sort of attitude.
No.
Yeah, and here's his comment. You cannot simply make up criticisms out of thin air like Verena does. It is unprofessional. It makes you look foolish, not me. And obviously when it was made clear that this was actually his own doing, and he said, well, it was just a simple mistake, without, apologizing for falsely accusing you of inventing criticisms out of thin air. And accusing you of looking foolish. That's just even on a non-scholarly public discourse level.
Right.
That is we don't even need to worry about professionalism. That's just rude.
Right. No one put up with abuse.
Here's another thing that's funny.
I'm engaging with you, Mr. Ellis.
Josephus. Okay, so Ralph says that Josephus is Saul. I'm not talking about Paul, not just Paul the Apostle, because we all know that he thinks Paul is Josephus. But he also says Solus, the Herodian, one of the characters that Josephus mentions in his Wars of the Jews and Antiquities. He says that's also Josephus. Now, Solus in Josephus was referred to by Josephus as a wicked man. So is he pretending to be 2 different people and calling him his other self wicked for some reason? That's what I want to know. And it's like, well, he was actually a spy, so he had to pretend to be somebody else, and then later,
But he's alleged bad guy, a troublemaker for sure. Josephus's description of Saul in the 60s that describes him as a violent troublemaker. So Josephus is, by Ellis's logic, would be describing his own alter ego as a bad troublemaking dude. And that doesn't make sense, does it? No, apart from the fact that even if you make the Saul to Paul connection, we have a body of literature from 2 different people, the historian Josephus and the theologian, Christian theologian Paul, 2 very distinct bodies of literature indicating 2 very distinct authors.
Right. I think it's time to take a look at those lists of names now. Let's kind of go find where it is. Oh, you know what? Before we do, let's look at the John the Baptist Conundrum. Oh, yes. I was talking about this earlier. That he says that John the Baptist died in the 1st century BCE, and Jesus asked the Pharaohs. By the way, in his books, he never stated that he abandoned this position, by the way. And he says Aristobulus, the high priest, is John the Baptist, because they're both called John, and both were executed by the Herods. Because goodness forbid there can be more than one John killed by the Herods in Judean history.
Mind you, though, we do have other sources that indicate that everyone is John Jacob Jingleheimer Smith.
Yeah.
What's interesting here is that John the Baptist, as Christian tradition describes him, he is a fiery apocalyptic preacher out in the wilderness calling people to righteousness and redemption so that they can clear a path for the coming of the Messiah. And that is very much out of step with the politics and ideology of the high priesthood before the war. Obviously, they're pro-Roman. They're not encouraging messianism or apocalypticism. And it is very hard for me to imagine that anyone who's anything like what John the Baptist is described as in Christian literature could possibly have ever been a high priest at the Jerusalem temple in the first century.
There are a lot of folks who think John the Baptist aligns pretty closely with the Essene ideology. And in fact, if you go to Qumran today, they have a little video that you can go watch that kind of introduces you to the history of Qumran. And they actually include some depictions of somebody named John who joins their group for a while, but then departs, kind of furtively suggesting John the Baptist was there among the Essenes.
If anyone wants a discussion of this very point, go to John the Baptist and ask Jacob about a recent interview with Lawrence Schiffman, where they actually discuss this point with a little more seriousness, I think, than Ralph Ellis is able to make. That's all I'm going to say.
I don't think Ralph would even be capable of comprehending anything in that interview I did with those two professionals. Not a chance. And and what's going on here in this conundrum, another conundrum involving John the Baptist, is that in King Jesus, it looks like I forgot to put the book's title in this, but it's in page 268 of King Jesus, Prince of Judaism and Rome, Prince of Judea and Rome. Sorry. And in that page, Ralph makes the argument that John the Baptist is Josephus' brother. And I'm about to read a little bit about why he thinks that. So not only does Ralph maintain his original positions, but lies and claims he doesn't, but he adds more absurd positions on top of it. It's like pouring outdated milk on cereal that's 5 years old, and then more outdated milk that's 10 years old, thinking it'll be good. And he says here, this is in page 268 of King Jesus, however, the new John Johanan ben Zacharias was likewise not impressed with being a living memorial to his late brother, and searched around for a different name. As the list of high priests demonstrates, the name Johanan, John, can easily be confused with or the equivalent of Joseph, and so the name he settled upon was Joseph ben Zacharias, and we know him rather better today as Saul Josephus. So he's making an argument that John was the real name of Josephus, the birth name of Josephus. Then he keeps going and says, this would mean, of course, that Saul Josephus' father was Zacharias, the husband of Elizabeth, who, according to the Quran, was also the guardian and foster father of Mary the Virgin.
Holy moly. There is no character I know of from the first century who is Joseph, son of Zacharias. Okay, you have Johanan ben Zakkai, and how he connects John and Joseph's names, Johanan and Joseph's names, they're different names. They're just different names. And there are a bunch of first century Jewish figures who have each of those names. There's no reason to even, it's a total non sequitur. It just doesn't even follow. That's my first observation. He's jamming things together here rather arbitrarily with no evidence. And then deciding that Josephus tells us his own father's name is Matthias, like his brother's name is Matthias. Why doesn't he say that Matthias is the name of John the Baptist's father, rather than say Josephus' father was Zacharias? It's just as valid, just as arbitrary.
And not to mention trying to also justify it by jumping to a text half a millennium later in the Quran and suppose that has more accurate historical information about the first century than
Dr. Adair.
Sources from the first century.
Right. He doesn't prioritize his sources, and that's something else that Christopher Lawson criticized him on. Christopher Lawson, who isn't me, by the way, criticized Ralph on. It's like, you don't prioritize your sources.
It's just breathtaking. He doesn't pause. He'll just go from one arbitrary connection to another arbitrary connection to a complete non sequitur without taking a breath. It really is astonishing.
He seems to take the omniscience of the narrator to quite the extreme. And as well as the univocality. Not only are these texts separated by multiple centuries, all referring to the same events, everybody agrees on the exact same narrative and everything. Everybody knows everything that's going on, and the only differences are in the spelling of names, and that all we have to do is fix those spellings, and we have this magical key to unlock all the secrets of figure that most of these texts aren't even talking about.
Now, if we look at page 266 of King Jesus, this is just 2 pages before this, okay? And so I'm going to leave this slide up here so you guys can think about this slide while I'm reading this. He says, so in the New Testament, Johanan ben Zakkai, the same guy you think is Josephus, Johanan ben Zakkai's name would actually have been John ben Zacharias, and if this name does not ring a bell with readers, we need to open the Bible a little more often. John ben Zacharias is more commonly known as John the Baptist. So we went from him being his brother, which is 2 pages after this. Actually, he was Josephus the whole time. That's the funny thing about this.
Well, look, Johanan ben Zakkai, Josephus, and Josephus's brother were all born at about the time that John the Baptist was being executed, according to Josephus's narrative. So the cross identification seems impossible on its face, just simply from the date. But as has been observed here, what's a few centuries? So what's within the first century, moving someone around? But John the Baptist, we're told by Josephus, is executed in the late 30s, which is presumably the time that Josephus, his brother, and right about there, Johanan ben Zakkai is born. So it's bizarre.
And then in page 196 of King Jesus, he says that Paul never mentioned the crucifixion, which I think is just utterly insane. And it's like, so what is the point of Paul's letters? That's not like, if you remove all the crucifixion references, which Ralph says are interpolations. What is the point?
Well,
what the hell is Paul talking about?
That's the foundation, essence of Paul's theology is the metaphysical significance of the execution and resurrection of Christ Jesus. And Paul refers to it repeatedly, obliquely and directly, because that is the overwhelming significant fact for Paul's theology, is the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's changed our relationship to the law, it's changed our relationship to God, it's changed the Gentiles' relationship to becoming a member of the house of Israel. For all of Paul's argumentation about the law, the admission of Gentiles, his entire theology is based on the metaphysical significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is referred to in what scholars agree are the authentic letters of Paul repeatedly, both directly and indirectly. He's executed on a stauros, Paul explicitly states. He preaches Christ crucified, as he says in his letter to the Galatians, again and again, both directly and indirectly. All of those references, but more than that, it's the foundation of Paul's whole theology and argumentation. No, that I'm very confident in saying is simply false.
Here's a list of every single time Paul mentions the crucifixion. And by the way, Ralph, I'm sorry, Pilate is mentioned in 1 Timothy. Yeah.
Actually, I think this list might be incomplete because I thought it's also included along with the Philippians hymn.
It might be. I might have forgotten about that, but well, here's a nearly complete list. If I did forget, if I did miss a verse in Philippians.
No matter what, the more you dig, the more evidence there is against Ralph, not more.
Right.
And First and Second Corinthians all mention crucifixion as their arguments in the letters are based on that fact and the significance of that fact. It's the foundation of the whole argument in those letters.
Yeah, the Philippians hymn does mention a death on a cross.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I've heard with the Philippians hymn, it does seem like it kind of breaks the flow of the rhetoric there, which would suggest that Paul had this hymn and thought the cross was so important he even tacked it into the hymn itself.
Yeah, there are some folks who think that the hymn pre-existed Paul and that he was working it in and edited it.
Yeah,
which is a possibility.
Yeah, at the very least, it's clearly in that letter, and it were just to say that every single time in a dozen places that was just put in by an editor for reasons.
Well, and this is something that I've talked about a bit recently on my TikTok channel. Most critical scholars don't lead the evidence; they try to follow the evidence, the data, to where it leads. Whereas most dogmatists, whether apologetic or some other type of dogmatist, have a location they want to get to, and the question isn't is that where the data push us. The question is, do the data stop me from getting there? And then the argument then becomes, well, this datum I can argue, I can get rid of, I can get this out of the way, I can get this out of the way. And it's not a case for the data push us in this direction. It's a case for I can get through the data to get to my goal. And that's what a lot of this is, only it's just here awful. It's just so incompetent.
You got a pile of facts, and that's not going to give Ralph any pause. It's exactly, he's not using Paul's actual argumentation or what appears to be Paul's, basic point and the thrust of his argument at all. He's not going with the evidence within Paul, as you say. He's fighting it systematically and saying that all of these references, and I would say these references, as I really understates the point, given the foundational importance of Christ's crucifixion for Paul's whole theology.
And here's his comment now. There is no crucifixion story in the epistles. There is no trial, scourging, spear, sponge, soldier, woman, none of that story. And the only thing to point out there is these are not Paul's exposition of these stories. These stories were shared when these churches were founded. These are just referential. These are all, the crucifixion, the cross, because all of the establishment of those narratives and the details would have predated these paranetic letters that are being sent back years later. So the notion that Paul, if we don't see Paul laying out in deep detail the whole story, that Paul didn't know the whole story, or Paul didn't believe the whole story, that's just nonsense.
I was bothered that I forgot Philippians 2:8, so it's there now.
All right.
Now I've got every reference in there now, I think.
Yeah. And I want to add to Dan's point about the story not being mentioned in Paul's letter. What would have been like the theological purpose of saying who specifically executed Jesus? So like if you go later to like say the epistles of Ignatius, or at least in some form, and I know there's a lot of question about its exact textual history, but it talks about also like being adamant that Jesus was specifically killed by Pilate, but it also because he's arguing with people that seem to deny like the physicality of Jesus' death. That doesn't seem to necessarily be the problem that Paul is fighting. So why bring up which exact prefect was the one who did Jesus in? It doesn't matter to his theology. So why bring it up?
It's not relevant to his argument.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was something my Martin Goodman, who was an instructor of mine at Oxford, would always drill into us the best way to interpret a text is to understand the rhetorical goals that the author has. What is it they're trying to achieve? Not just say, but achieve. And if you can keep that in mind as you try to interpret their text, you can make better sense of what they are saying and why. And so if you ignore a rhetorical goal, then you're just going to, again, manipulate the data in order to say it's not an obstacle to me achieving the goal that I had before I even started.
Right. Important point. Now, somebody brought up in the chat that, First Timothy wasn't written by Paul. Actually, there's a lot of division on if he did it right or not write it. But even if
right.
Go ahead, James.
Well, even when we got that one in pseudo-Paul, we found it in Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
Yeah. I don't think it matters that you included a pseudo-Pauline epistle in the list.
Yeah, and I think his claim is just generally the letters of Paul or the epistles do not say this. I don't think he actually even specifies the authentic letters of Paul. And of course, since he also thinks Paul is like a half dozen other people, what he can even call pseudo-Pauline or not seems to be an even weaker leg to stand on.
Oh, yeah. Now, this one's interesting. This is from Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, page 286. Darth Vader is Josephus Flavius. That's what Ralph actually believes this.
Mary Magdalene.
So this slide is pretty much an imitation of what that page looks like. He has Vader on the right, just like it is in the book. And he's making an argument that George Lucas, or maybe a producer or two in Star Wars, might have been Jewish and secretly knew the truth about Odessa. And he says that
George Lucas is in on this conspiracy, is he?
Yeah, he says that.
Got it. Check. There is nothing so bizarre now that you can tell me Ralph said that it will not surprise me now.
He says that Masada sounds like Jeddah, and since the Jews were slaughtered there during the final battle of the war, he's basically saying it's Order 66. Caesar Masada is Order 66.
So we were Darth Vader or what? Vespasian and Titus?
I think he might. I think he thinks Ananias is Anakin, and him murdering James is Anakin killing Mace Windu.
It's worth noting that Star Wars fans already have their own questionable etymologies. Like, they tried to argue that the name Vader itself was a hint that he's actually going to be Luke's father because Vader is close to the Dutch word for father. Yeah. Even though that clearly hadn't been thought out by Lucas when he wrote the script back in the late 70s. So already Star Wars fans, are stretching the limits of etymology. Ralph decides, hold my, I don't know what his
just shatter them
choices.
Yeah. So he literally thinks that Star Wars is a space opera retelling of the Jewish revolt.
Wow.
He makes that argument in this further in the book that it's a retelling of the war.
Okay.
Star Wars is not a good place to recount history, but as a physics teacher in the past, it is a great way to come up with really weird physics problems, which I've given my students in the past. You can directly calculate the power of the Force from the scenes from Vader lifting people, but that's another video.
You're right. And this is a post on Facebook where Ralph Ellis is defending his claim that Star Wars is the Jewish revolt. And he said, "Oh, Masada looks like the Rogue One mountain, the mountain of Rogue One, a Star Wars story." Like, so now he's picking a very late Star Wars film. He's not even trying to use the original film to prove his argument, which is bonkers, regardless. What are your guys' thoughts on this? I'm out of words on this one.
So first thing I'm going to notice is when I saw the image below, it actually made me think not of Masada, but of Lord of the Rings of Minas Tirith, the walled city from there. So if anything, that's going to be the direction of influence, all things considered.
Right. Mr. Tolkien on the conspiracy as well, right, Mr. Ellis? Has he tried to work with C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, or I don't know, Gone with the Wind?
All right, guys, we've arrived at the list.
Ooh.
Everybody Ralph thinks is Jesus. It's in the top right there. Everybody that Ralph thinks is Josephus, kind of in the middle bottom. Yeah, and on the right. Everybody that he thinks is Joseph, and on the left, on the bottom left. Look at all them names.
Now, these figures, my, of course, as a historian, is that many of these figures are totally different in their politics, their political affiliations, the governments they're affiliated with, the political or military movements they're affiliated with. He does not even pause again at combining people who are enemies, political enemies, simultaneously in history. It's utterly breathtaking. And then the sheer numbers of the people that he's cross-identifying, another breathtaking fact. It's like, again, we would, for each of these identifications, we would need essays. We would need multiple pieces of evidence to indicate. But you'll just go from one to the next to the next.
And that says Hippocrates, as in the Hippocratic Oath.
That's right. That.
And also, I see in there Lancelot as well as King Arthur, even though they weren't the same person in the legends. In fact, they had some personal issues.
Well, on the Arthurian on the list of names of Joseph, I didn't put Lancelot there because Ralph doesn't think that's Lancelot.
Okay.
No, he thinks Josephus is Lancelot.
Oh, okay. All right, that's more sensible.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Even though it's not true, it would make ideologically speaking, because he's trying to make Josephus and Jesus enemies.
Well, does that imply Josephus had an affair with Mary Magdalene?
Ralph thinks that Josephus had an affair with Pope Pio.
Cross identifications work either.
Yeah. He makes the argument about Hippocrates. Let me see there. I put the citation there. So that's in citation 10. That's in the Gross Upper, page 238. So I'm going to go to page 238. And I'm going to read his argument. You guys are going to laugh, I think. There it is. So it would seem likely that this Hippocrates Esus, who was in Rome in the 1st century A.D., referred to King Abgar's Esus Okama V of Edessa, the father of King Jesus Esus. Now, originally, he argued that Jesus was Hippocrates, and then he shifted it to Abgar. So Hippocrates is going back and forth. Sometimes he's Jesus, sometimes he's Joseph. And page 232, where he starts making the argument, he says, surprisingly, there was a very famous, powerful. Oh, hold on. Let me read this from the beginning. This is even funnier. So, who was this 1st century Hippocrates? Well, first of all, we need to decipher the name Hippocrates into the English to see what it actually means. In fact, this name was derived from horsepower. The Greek word for horsepower, or powerful horse. So, who was this powerful horse who came to meet Emperor Augustus in Rome during the early 1st century? Surprisingly, it was a very powerful horse in Rome in the 1st century, because we translate horsepower into Aramaic instead of Greek, we can derive Esus, and he put that he's got it transliterated in Hebrew right there. And he says, now that is interesting, very interesting indeed. It looks like we have a very cunning and erudite author who is very familiar with Aramaic, is having a little game with his readers. Because if he wants to be exceedingly devious, the name Jesus can be very loosely translated into Greek as Hippocrates. So if someone wished to conceal the presence of this royal prince in Rome, they could wax lyrical about Hippocrates, the great healer, and avoid the hot pokers of the Catholic Inquisition.
The Catholic Inquisition that existed in 80 AD? What?
Right.
Yeah, so he's arguing that this is what I just said a moment ago, that Hippocrates is Jesus, and then a couple of pages later he flips it to Joseph like it's a coin.
Yep.
At that point, Hippocrates is two different people in Ralph's world, Ralph's fantasy.
Yeah, it's also worth noting the Inquisition wasn't that well unified in actually banning or blocking books. I've actually held copies of forbidden books or censored books by the Inquisition, and the Italian Inquisition and the Spanish Inquisition had different collections. So I've looked through the Spanish collection of banned books, and it doesn't include Copernicus in there, though other versions did. So it's if the Inquisition is all powerful, they can't even keep straight who needs to be banned, let alone banning and censoring books 1,000 years before they existed.
Right. And Ralph fans will argue that I'm misinterpreting his work. I'm not misinterpreting his work. This is what he believes. Ralph will lie and say that's not what he said, but that's exactly what he said. He was saying Hippocrates was fabricated as a cover for Jesus. So yes, that is his argument.
So the
And he says
is just an allegorical cover for the historical king of Edessa.
right. And he also says that Elisha in the Old Testament is also Jesus. And Gehazi is Josephus, another Old Testament character.
How does that work? Were the authors?
They lived like 1,000 years, or 800 to 1,000 years before Josephus and Jesus were even born. So he's got people being like people that lived hundreds of years before Josephus and Jesus being the same person, hundreds of years after they died being the same person. Were they covering their existence up before they were even born?
Breathtaking. Utterly breathtaking. Now, what does
Unbelievable.
Elijah identification work? The people who wrote the Hebrew Bible before this person in the first century existed, were they writing about a character or just, again, an interpolation into Hebrew literature of Elijah, of this person who was in the story of the first century character? How do we understand how Elijah thing would work?
It gets better. Ralph actually argues that Josephus interpolated the Old Testament Isaiah. To add the word virgin in there. Make it look like that the Odessans are in the Old Testament. There it is. There's Emmanuel right there. And then Ralph will accuse Neil Senlak of believing in the prophecy of Emmanuel. In fact, no, Ralph believes in the prophecy. Ralph does. I mean, he's got Josephus editing Isaiah, even though the mistake that he's talking about, the mention of virgin, was in the Septuagint, centuries before Josephus.
See, that's it.
So was he time traveling to modify the Septuagint?
Not to mention having to create the entire Hippocratic corpus in an older version of Greek before somehow hiding it in Aramaic.
These things, none of these things can be heard around. As he's leaping from century to century.
I think it's. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say he's just following the Scott Bakula rules. It's quantum leap, jumping from century to century.
Well, and I think it's always such a convenient kind of methodological shoehorn to say somebody is like encoding stuff to hide it from authorities. I can never take that seriously when decoding it just requires knowing the language well enough to know the etymology of the encoding. If you're encoding it for folks who already know the language, you're not really encoding it. The notion that we can decode these things just by knowing the Aramaic etymology is just ludicrous. The notion that a bunch of Aramaic speakers were like, they've hidden it, we don't know where it went. Oh, it was in the fact that Adiabene means sons of Adai. It was right there in front of us the whole time. Like, people don't encode stuff in extremely obvious, open, and clear ways. And so that little methodological shoehorn there, which I see in a number of places, has just always baffled me that people take that seriously.
Yeah, it's extremely standard conspiracy thinking. Any sort of symbol being interpreted to fit the grander narrative one way or the other.
Right.
In Jesus King of Edessa, Ralph claims, this is in page 185, that Josephus fabricated Adiabene, made it all up. Now, if we go to this next slide here, in the Achievements of the Deified Augustus, which was written a couple of decades prior to Josephus's birth, unless Arnold Schwarzenegger and him were time traveling, this text mentions Adiabene.
Yes.
Ralph responded to this and lied and said that this text never mentioned Adiabene, despite the fact that I've shown it on screen when I did the prior critique of Ellis with you, James, and Derek and Neil. I showed this slide. But no, he's talking about Armenia. No, this text mentions Adiabene. I'm sorry. Not sorry. Adiabene's mentioned.
Could have been Jean-Claude Van Damme who time traveled. I don't know if you saw Time Cop, but
I think I saw one of the Time Cops.
One of the greatest movies of all time.
Yeah. That was hilarious. That movie's pretty good.
I have to admit, I'm a Philistine. I haven't seen Time Cop.
That was a '90s movie. That was a different era.
I mean, honestly, I mean, if somebody wanted to, it's like if somebody wanted to use Ralph Ellis's logic, somebody could argue that General Santayana is Vespasian, and that the Alamo was the Jewish temple, because the siege looks alike in some ways. Why
And
not?
undoubtedly have a Jesus of Guatemala. Must be Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. You're going on my joke there. Guatemala sounds like Guatemala, so why can't Jesus be the king of Guatemala? Just screw it. Put Rome in Mexico. Why not? The whole war happened in Mexico.
And
Well,
the name of the Virgin's mother, could that be any accident? Please.
Oh yeah, Santayana, Anna, the mother of Mary, in one of those apocryphal gospels.
As Dr. Adair pointed out too, they went to Corpus Christi. Could that be an accident?
That's where
Well,
Christ
mind you-
was born.
yeah. Well, remember in one of our earlier streams, I actually proved using these sorts of methods that the Jews came from China because the previous dynasty was the Zhou dynasty. So to make that possessive, it'd be Joe-da, so Judah. Obviously, that's how it really works.
Clearly.
Yeah, if Ralph has often claimed that he worked at an airport, he was flying and recently I found out that he claimed that he actually did fly in an airplane. I used to joke about, well, if Ralph were piloting an airplane, you would never arrive at your destination because this location sounds like that location. But no, apparently that wasn't much of a joke. I'm like, I would never board a plane with Ralph piloting. Hell
Yeah.
If
no.
the cross identified, you couldn't miss.
Like let's say
Yeah.
you're flying to China. Sorry guys, we're going to Chile because it sounds like China.
Oh, I was actually thinking you want to fly to the Netherlands and you end up in New York City because that used to be called New Amsterdam.
Washington D.C. is Washington State.
But here with this description, we find him simply ignoring actual evidence. This is an inscription that can, with some degree of clarity and high probability, be dated to, as you point out, decades before Josephus's birth. And it mentions clearly Adiabene. All the readers, all the translators and interpreters of the language and paleography here say Adiabene. I know of no one but Ralph who says that this inscription does not mention Adiabene, and Josephus simply did not make up the name of the place. We have good solid evidence from an inscription, as you point out, that predates Josephus that mentions it.
Worth also mentioning, there's more than one inscription of the Acts of the Deified Augustus, so it's not also just one small carving hidden in a cave. It's it was empire-wide, and we have plenty of records of it. Unless you're following the wrong TikTokers who say the Roman Empire was invented by, what was it, the Jesuits? I too many conspiracy theories for one stream, I think. I think I made Dan cry. I apologize.
Oh gosh, no, I engaged with that creator last year. That was a mess.
Yeah.
What happened?
It was it's a long story, but there are a lot of claims being made there that the Roman Empire never existed. It was a later fabrication.
I remember
That Alexander the Great was a woman, as well as several other figures from Egyptian history, and just a lot of really off the wall stuff. And I tried responding a couple of times, and it was clear that this was another individual who was not going to be reasoned with. So,
Yeah, I mean, somebody else could make the argument that all, like with Ralph's logic, all the Caesars of Rome are the same guy because they're all called Caesar, all of them, and all the emperors of China are the same guy, and that's it.
They share, sharing the same title is enough for Ralph to identify. It's the only evidence he needs to make an identification. Now, the monarchs of England, for example, there's a new king of England who's just succeeded his mother, and he's got a lot of the same titles that his mother does, and his mother inherited a whole bunch of the same titles from his father.
What's funny is Ralph, when he's done responses against me on his Facebook profile, he would say, "Well, Jacob, the Queen of England has a bunch of titles. Okay, so my argument's like that. All these different characters you think are conflations are not conflations. It's different titles of Jesus. You're saying completely different people that Josephus is recording in his work are titles.
But by saying it's a title, you're almost admitting that more than one person had that, handled. Like I'm saying, that more than one person can, if it's a title, it's going to be held by more than one person in succession. So the fact that Charles, his mother Elizabeth, her father George VI, all share the same title, right, doesn't tell me that they're all.
Yeah.
In fact, it gives me no reason. In fact, it gives me a good reason to think that different people held those same titles: defender of the faith, head of the Church of England, etc.
Exactly.
And
Those,
and of course, even if the names are identical, it can still be different people. So you mentioned the King of England. This is Charles III.
Right.
And I'm here in Boston, where we have the Charles River, named after Charles I, from about almost 400 years earlier. Because Boston was founded in 1630. We're gonna have a party in just a few years for our big birthday here. So I guess, using Ralph's logic, Charles III is going to lead the English Civil War.
And there's another Dan McClellan in my organization who gets a lot of my emails. So I'll have to ask and make sure that we're not the same person.
I feel like ending this presentation by looking at Ralph Ellis's methodology. It's all circular. Using the Gospels to conflate multiple characters in Josephus. Josephus is separating Jesus into multiple characters. Using the Gospels to tell when Josephus is lying. Also use Josephus to tell when the Gospels are lying. If multiple characters are similar to Jesus in different ways, they're the same person. That's how he argues. And the reason why in the middle arrow is going back and forth is because it's circular. He'll go from one direction of using Josephus to tell when the Gospels are lying about Jesus, and vice versa.
I cannot help but notice, of course, that Josephus is a historian writing for a wide pagan audience. The Gospels, of course, are religious documents writing for a very sectarian audience. Historians, critical scholars over the last 250 years have shown the Gospels are highly mythologized. A good deal of it is demonstrably fictional and allegorical, based on reworkings of Hebrew texts. So if he can't see the distinction between, say, the reliability of the history of Josephus, I'm not saying that Josephus doesn't have an axe to grind, that he's always accurate. I'm just saying there's a difference in kind between what appears to be a detail-oriented historian writing for a broad audience and what are clearly religious texts written for a sectarian audience and that appear to be highly mythologized allegory.
And briefly, if I may respond to something that Mr. Ellis keeps putting in the comments, the Joseph Smith papyri are an edition of what's called the Breathing Permit of Hor. It's a part of the Book of the Dead. The English Book of Abraham is not a translation of those papyri. And he more than a dozen times has asserted this is what I believe, but he's not in charge of what I believe. So for the sake of being open, I'm happy to respond to your question, Mr. Ellis, but you've not responded to any of our concerns with your methodologies and instead are just resorting to petty sectarianism and just insult. So I'm here because I have some friends who were libeled, who were harassed, who were publicly belittled, who had websites created with their names on them in order to mock and demean them. And that's just awful form. So I've answered your question. You cannot answer any of ours. And I wish you would go back to being an airline pilot if that's what you were before, because you're not doing anyone any favors who is concerned about trying to reconstruct the history of our world.
Right. Do you guys like this diagram? Do you agree that this is a pretty okay look at circular reasoning?
Yeah,
I tried.
Yeah. I would add that there is like a general phenomenon I see in a lot of pseudo-archaeology, pseudo-scholarship stuff, that the mere looks like, therefore is equation is used so often in the reasoning. These things look similar or similar enough to make really grand, sweeping conclusions. And whether you're looking at people making claims about nuclear weapons in antiquity on TikTok, or what Ralph Ellis does, basically looks like that's all that needs to be there to make his conclusions, no matter how outlandish it is, or if any other context might show it is ridiculous. And like I say, I was just looking through his article, trying to apply astrology and precession of the equinoxes to it, and I see the exact same problem. He just looks but doesn't ask some really important questions to make him realize his entire premise is faulty.
Right.
Right. Some visible, one visible similarity, or even two visible similarities, does not mean that they're connected in any way. There are the famous cross that Christians use. There are various uses of cross images across different cultures and religions. It's a very simple image. To find a similar image or two, just as you're finding a sound similarity in names or something, is simply insufficient to make any connection, much less a full identification. You need a bunch of evidence. You need to marshal a bunch of evidence to make a single identification.
Yeah.
Less identification that Mr. Ellis is so comfortable making.
And this kind of methodology also puts the cart before the horse by suggesting that the fact that it serves his theory constitutes evidence that it's true. In other words, these look similar. I'm going to say they're the same. Look, that serves my theory. That is therefore evidence that they are the same. That is something that can be sometimes a little more furtive, not quite so open, but that's definitely another way that this puts the methodological cart before the horse.
Right. Yeah, so I think we pretty much covered it for today. I thank both of you for joining me. I want to reiterate what I said earlier. Dr. Adair and Dr. McClellan, I very much enjoyed reading both of your articles criticizing Ellis back in my early days of Ellis criticizing and harassing me. And I had a lot of laughter reading that and sharing it, and laughing of others.
I have to say that after their work, that here we are years after their initial work, which seemed to me to lay waste to any credibility that Ralph Ellis might have, he still has tens of thousands of followers and fans.
Right.
I find it astonishing that we're still having to discuss this after Dr. Adair and after Dr. McClellan did their devastating work, which should have put.
Yeah. I also, do you want to say something, Dr. Adair? I didn't mean to.
No. I was just agreeing.
Okay. I also enjoyed Neil's recent video on Ellis, on which he tackled more of Ralph's racism and sexism pretty thoroughly, and that was devastating. It's very devastating on Ralph.
As well, climate science, you name it. Ralph is not shy about
it. Was awful.
On a range of subjects.
I'll just leave a link to it so you guys can go find out what I'm talking about in that video for those that haven't seen it.
Yeah, just a very quick summary. Not only does Ralph apparently know Aramaic better than Aramaic scholars, Greek better than Greek scholars, he also apparently knows climate modeling better than climate scientists. And those are the less despicable things that he has said. So, yeah.
It's wild. It's wild. He carries this methodology across to apparent expertise and omniscience on various other things too. Really,
Yep. Well, I thank all three of you for joining me today, and this was fun. I think everybody that super chatted their questions for today. Thanks for the support of my channel, and thanks to everybody else except for Ralph and his ridiculous fans for participating in the live chat. I'll see all of you later.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.